So osteoporosis, from my perspective, is a disease state of being in a catabolic breakdown state. It is associated with low muscle mass and is ultimately just dysfunctional bone metabolism. The right diet to support bone growth and muscle growth is critical if you want to successfully reverse osteoporosis. So stick around because I'm going to go through my 2024 update to the diet recommendations that we make for our patients with osteoporosis. We have learned so much over the last couple of years of how to help people to improve bone quality, improve bone density, and to help them really feel better overall through the lens of health span. So what I'd like to do is just introduce our framework for health optimization as it relates to bone health. So you can see in our pyramid of health optimization that the bottom part of this pyramid, the bottom part, the foundation, includes all the foundational things that we think are critical for every person to succeed. You can see one of the foundational principles is nutrition. If you don't have the right nutrition, then none of the other stuff is going to have as much of an impact as it could. You can be on all the hormones, peptides, and drugs you want, but if you are protein deficient, nutrient deficient, you're not going to make bone. Arguably, this is one of the most important, if not the most important part of improving bone and improving health span overall. So what do we tell people to eat? Well, we start with protein. The reason why we start with protein is because in a lot of other perspectives of health and diet and nutrition, protein is ignored. Protein has been ignored for years because people are afraid to talk about it. People are afraid to talk about it because it brings up emotions around animals, around plants, around carnivore, around vegan, around pH. And it's just such a challenging topic to talk about that people are more likely to just spend time talking about carbohydrates and dietary fat. Unfortunately, you can manipulate those other two variables all you want. If you're protein deficient, you're still not going to grow muscle and bone. You're just not. So what we recommend for people is usually starting around 1 gram of protein per pound of actual body weight. Now, this is true for most of our osteoporosis patients because we're looking at ideal body weight, and most of them are actually relatively lean to begin with. If someone is particularly obese, then we start talking about 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. That's kind of a more challenging conversation to have, especially in the face of osteoporosis and obesity. That's a tough combo to fix together. But one of the things I want to mention here is that you should always talk to your own doctor about your own potential impact of protein if you have kidney deficiency, if you have chronic kidney disease, especially stage 3 and beyond. You're likely to be on protein restriction. So I'm not telling you what to do. You have to talk to your own team. I'm just talking about what I tell my patients to do. If you want to do that in kilograms, it's around 2.2 grams per kilogram. And that might bring up a thought for you that goes back to this idea that we only need 0.8 grams per kilogram. And that's actually the recommendation from the US government and other governments around the world. The data that supported this 0.8 grams per kilogram was based off of nitrogen studies that have not necessarily been proven to be wrong. The approach is valid, but it's only valid in the need for acute or sudden immediate protein needs. In other words, you need to consume 0.8 gram per kilogram to avoid acute protein deficiency syndromes, to actually get sick immediately or in the short term around not eating enough protein. However, if we want to optimize, if we want to build muscle, build bone, and improve our health span overall, we need more protein. And that's probably somewhere around 2 to 3 grams per kilogram per day. So another thing that comes up when we talk about this is this IGF-1 theory of aging. If you haven't heard of this, I'll just give you the quick summary, which is if you look at aging studies, there's multiple studies in mice. There are multiple influencers that say that we need to reduce this thing called IGF-1. They also manipulate the blue zone data to support this as well. IGF-1 stands for insulin-like growth factor 1. And it is something that goes up that you can measure in blood. It goes up when you're anabolic, meaning like you're making muscle, you're making bone. It goes down when you are in a fasted state. It goes down when you are in calorie restriction. And so what they've shown in my studies is that if you reduce IGF-1 for the long term, you'll see an increase in lifespan. And that kind of makes sense. The problem is that in humans, we're much more complex than that. We also don't live in cages. And so for humans, we need to develop muscle. We need to protect ourselves from falls. We need to have muscle for other reasons like insulin sensitivity and immune function and all kinds of other things. So for us, if we chronically suppress IGF-1, we will not build muscle, we will not build bone. So this theory of reducing IGF-1 for health span is great if you're a mouse, not great if you're a human planning on having some muscle mass as you age, which we all absolutely need. So then when it comes to the best sources of protein, in my opinion, the best source comes from meat. The reason why it comes from meat or animal protein is that it's a complete protein. It has all of the essential amino acids that you need. There's only one plant product that has all of those essential amino acids, and that's soy. I'll get to soy later. But plant protein in general, including soy, is more poorly absorbed. So if we're going to look at that gram per pound or kilogram need, and you want to get it through plant protein, then you need to increase that need by about 60% on average. So let's say you're a 120-pound woman and you want to get 100 to 120 grams of protein daily, which will be my recommendation for my patients if they're starting out with us. If they are eating a plant-based diet and they're doing it for whatever reason, then I'm going to say, okay, let's multiply that 120 times 0.6, and now you have your new number. And it's going to be upwards of 180 grams, closer to 200 grams. That's really hard to do, and definitely hard to do through plant sources. So then that brings up some emotion around, what about animals? I heard that animal production and cows in particular are burping out methane and they're going to destroy the environment and we have to get rid of cows in order for us to save our planet. Okay, I'm just going to address this quickly. I could talk about this for hours, but the short of this is that we have to remember that agriculture as a total thing is only producing about 10% of greenhouse gases. And that's all the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, all of it. So it's about 10%. So if we stopped producing food altogether, we would save 10% of greenhouse gases. We would also die. But the other 90%, a lot of that is done by petroleum products, production of gas, burning of gas. So we really need to reconsider this idea that we're going to have a significant impact on our environment by impacting agriculture at all. Now, not to say 10% is nothing, but think of it like this too. Of that 10%, about half of it comes from plants and about half of it comes from animals. If we were to eliminate the animals, then you would obviously need to grow more plants because we have to replace those calories. And because you're replacing those calories with things that are less nutrient dense, you're going to actually have to grow more. So the impact on the planet is going to actually be worse if you were to eat a plant-based diet exclusively for the entire planet. Less efficient delivery of nutrients means that you're going to have to grow a lot of plants. And if you don't have animals, particularly cows, to put the carbon dioxide in the environment back into the soil, then you're going to have to add that, especially through nitrogen, through fertilizer, which has a more negative impact on the environment than do the cows, which are actually upcycling things that we can't eat and that nobody can eat other than cows. And they're actually putting the carbon dioxide back into back into the soil, not the oil. So then when it comes to this idea that we have to consider eating plants only from an ethical perspective, that you don't want to kill animals, I totally dig that. I love animals. I've often thought about raising cows, but my concern is that I would be so attached to my animals that I wouldn't be able to slaughter them. I do have chickens, I do eat their eggs, but I am an animal lover. So I totally get this. But having been on several farms, having seen how plants are produced and what you have to do to protect them and then to harvest them, you have to recognize that there's no bloodless diet. You just get to choose. Our existence will leave a footprint no matter what we choose to eat. If we're going to consume, we are going to kill. It's part of being human. It's part of being on this planet. So you can choose to kill small animals through the production of plants, or you can choose to kill large animals through the production of meat in animal husbandry. You do get to choose, but there are implications of your choice. There's an impact of your choice. So let's talk a little bit about cows versus the white meats, chicken, pork, and fish. So cows get a bad rap from an environmental perspective, but remember that cows are some of the only animals that can effectively put carbon dioxide back into the soil. So whether or not you want to eat them, we do need cows on regenerative farms. Cows have a unique capacity to upcycle plants that humans can't eat. So upcycle things that are otherwise going to go to waste, and they're actually being able to consume that and convert it into very high quality protein, which is amazing. Cows also have the capacity to prevent those things from actually eventually rotting and producing methane on their own. They can consume them, break them down, and yes, they'll burp out methane, but guess what? That methane was going to actually come out anyway, because those plants are going to decompose over time if the cows eat them or not. So compare then a cow to chicken and pork from a food perspective. Cows are going to process everything through their 4 stomachs. They're remarkable animals in that way. Chickens, and pigs only have 1 stomach, so they're monogastric animals. So these animals are going to pass on whatever it is that they're eating. So especially if they're conventionally raised and they're eating GMO, corn, soy, they're eating glyphosate, they're eating other pesticides, you're going to get a little bit of that in your food and in your meat. So this is why if people can do it, I prefer for them to consume red meat if they can tolerate it. But there is some genetic variability to the toleration of saturated fat, so we do have to take that into consideration. I also just want to take a quick mention of regenerative agriculture, which is people will say bad things about the way that cows and other animals are raised, and I totally agree with that too. The concentrated animal feeding operations that CAVOs, that cows and other animals are in are terrible, and I totally get that. But I don't think we should turn our back on the necessity of raising these animals. I just think we should do them in a better way. We have right down the road from us a regenerative agriculture farm, which is amazing. Very fortunate to have that very close by. So we buy our food just right down the road from the farm. So we have the capacity to do that. Harder to do if you live in a city, but there are more and more of these farms coming online. And essentially the whole idea is that you take the animals, put them in their natural habitat and grow the vegetables in their more natural habitat. You commingle the animals and the vegetables, and you get better vegetables and you get healthier animals. And you can do this in a sustainable way, which reduces the impact of all of it on the environment, especially if you're shopping locally. So I really think that this is the answer to a lot of our agricultural and animal husbandry issues. And it is becoming more common. So find that and support that if you can. Okay, so let's switch and let's talk about vegetables, because people like to eat vegetables. Now, I'm a big fan of the carnivore community. I love listening to the science and the data, and I love the arguments around vegans and carnivores. It just fascinates me. I think that there is value in vegetables, and I think that we can eat vegetables. We don't need to be that restricted. We've been eating vegetables for a very, very long time. However, even though vegetables can contain some dense nutrients, there are things in vegetables that we need to be aware of, but not so much that we just have to avoid them. We have to know that, are they an issue for us? And is this something that we need to change the way that we cook the vegetable, or maybe some vegetables we should avoid because they can inhibit gut function, they can provoke inflammation, they can block absorption of nutrients. And so we just have to understand which of these anti-nutrients are in which of these vegetables and how to prepare them. And we can do this, we can avoid this. So one of the most popular things for people to eat is the idea of leafy greens. So we're talking about spinach, we're talking about kale, other lettuces. And these can be very, very dense sources of nutrients. Spinach in particular, though, is very high in oxalates. I don't tolerate raw spinach. I can eat cooked spinach, but raw spinach hurts my stomach. And I find that's true for a lot of people. Kale contains both oxalates and phytates. This, again, can be cooked out. A lot of people like to eat kale salads. Again, I don't tolerate this. I don't eat either two of these, but they are dense sources of nutrients. And if you tolerate them, then that's okay. If you want to cook them, you can cook some of these things out. I'll talk about preparation here in a minute. And then there's cruciferous vegetables. Technically, kale is a cruciferous vegetable too. But talking about things like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, bok choy, all of these things are not without their risks either. And so there are, again, some of these oxalates and phytates in both of these things, but you're more likely to cook broccoli and cauliflower. If I eat raw broccoli, then my stomach gets really upset. If I eat cooked broccoli, I'm fine. And I like cooked broccoli. I serve my kids cooked broccoli all the time. And I'll eat it a little bit. So these things I think can be very, very helpful, but there's some other things to consider then with cruciferous vegetables, which is the glucosinolates and these thing called goitrogens. Both of these have the potential to impact thyroid function. I think as long as you're not eating massive amounts of them, like I see people talk about eating broccoli for protein, you would have to eat pounds of broccoli. If you're eating pounds of broccoli, then you might impact your thyroid. If you're eating a serving of broccoli, it's probably okay. But if you have a significant thyroid dysfunction, maybe you should avoid these things. And this is where custom nutrient recommendations are really helpful. I wanted to go back to the phytates too, because one of the things that people ask me all the time is, if I'm taking my calcium supplement with food, is it going to bind to the calcium and prevent it from being absorbed? And the answer is yeah, potentially. Phytates do bind to other minerals. They do bind to calcium. The oxalates can cause kidney stones. It can cause gut dysfunction. They can be inflammatory. Tannins, which are also common in cruciferous vegetables, they are polyphenols rather, that interfere with the digestion of proteins. So we do need to be cognizant of this and recognize that if we are going to consume these things, we need to consume them probably in the right form, and we need to prepare them in the right way. And there are lots of variables here, but in general, if you want to get the most anti-nutrients out of your vegetables, boiling is the best way to do it. Now, obviously, boiling some of these things doesn't make sense. Like, I don't think boiling spinach is a good idea. But you can boil broccoli and cauliflower. That's how we prep it. A little water, steam it for the most part, but they're kind of being boiled and they're being prepared at a very high temperature, and it'll knock some of those things out. Not all, but some. Oxalates in particular are water soluble and will come out into the water. The other thing you can do is steaming. And so it's, again, not going to be quite as effective because they're not saturated in the water, but you're still going to get some of those things out. So steam, and do not use the water that comes off of those things. Soaking things like beans and legume, which I'll talk about later, can help to pull some of the phytates out. So if you're going to consume beans, you definitely need to soak them. You can also sprout them, but sprouting takes a lot of time and effort, but it is probably a good thing. Fermentation is another way to reduce phytates in general, because fermentation will help to break those things down. And then eating it in conjunction with things like vitamin C. Now, vitamin C is going to be in it, but consuming vitamin C in addition to it can actually help bind the phytates and can help with absorption of other nutrients. So those are all ways that you can consider preparing your vegetables, or pairing it with either a vitamin C supplement or fruit that have vitamin C in it to help to absorb those things and to block some of those anti-nutrients. And I want to say this again, I kind of mentioned it earlier, but remember that vegetables are not protein sources. Yes, they have a little bit of protein in it, but you should not substitute 3 pounds of broccoli for 6 ounces of beef. Not the same thing. Your body's not going to know what to do with it. All right, so then let's switch and let's talk about starchy veggies. So for people that need more carbohydrates than you're going to get through non-starchy veggies are a great way to do that. And they have a lot of other nutrients as well. So potatoes, sweet potatoes, yams, squash, parsnips, plantains, taro, these are all things that people like to consume on a regular basis. They do also have some anti-nutrients, as do all plants. It's just part of being a plant. And so some of the same preparation principles would be necessary here. Not a lot of people are eating raw potatoes and squash and parsnips, so it's really hard to do. So we should cook those things. Just remember that you need to watch your carbohydrate content. You need to make sure that you are staying within your carbohydrate tolerance level. Again, most people with osteoporosis that are coming into our practice are close to their ideal body weight. They are not insulin resistant. They aren't very far down the road of metabolic dysfunction. So they can generally need more carbohydrate to improve muscle mass and ultimately improve bone health. All right, so before we move on, if you are enjoying this content, please do me a favor and click that subscribe button. This helps me to help other people. If you want to watch how we put this all together, all this information and all of our videos, put it into one place, consider joining our masterclass. The link for that is down in the description below. It's totally free. There's also a small opportunity there to ask questions as well. So feel free to join us for that. We run it about every 2 to 3 weeks, depending on the schedule. Okay, so what about other carbohydrate sources? Well, fruit is a great source of carbohydrates. It's a great source of other nutrients. It's particularly vitamin C, like I mentioned earlier. My favorites would be berries, apples. I've done videos on prunes before, which have the benefit from a GI perspective, but also actually can, on its own, improve bone mineral density, probably through the boron that's in it. So a lot of people are consuming those. Again, great sources of nutrients, polyphenols. There are less anti-nutrients in fruit. And I'll just speak to that for a second, which is vegetables are not made by plants to be consumed by other animals. Plants make fruit to be consumed by animals. So it would make sense that if a plant wants to make something to be consumed to help to spread the seeds out, which is what happens when animals consume fruit and then they walk around and they poop out the seeds, the fruits are not going to be as heavily laden in anti-nutrients because the plant wants the animals to eat the fruit. Plants don't want to be eaten themselves, so they're going to protect themselves with these anti-nutrients. So the only other issue with fruit then is the carbohydrate. These are going to be more dense in carbohydrate for the most part. Again, just know what your carbohydrate tolerance level is. If your weight is going up, if your fat mass is going up, if your insulin levels or A1C and glucose are going up, then you are above your carbohydrate tolerance level. And so just consider that as you consider what to consume. All right, so we've talked about protein, we've talked about carbohydrate, and now let's talk about dietary fat. So if you are eating an adequate protein diet and you're using the mostly animal products to get there, you are probably getting adequate dietary fat. Protein and fat come together in animal sources of protein, whereas carbohydrate and protein come together in plant sources of protein. This is why people that eat a carnivore diet tend to lose a significant amount of weight and gain muscle mass, whereas vegans tend to lose both weight and muscle mass because they're protein deficient, but also likely calorie deficient, until you figure out what you can eat on a vegan diet. And ultimately you end up adding in a lot of carbohydrates, getting insulin resistant, and fat mass goes up. I see it all the time. So if you're getting protein from animal products, you probably are getting adequate dietary fat. If you need more calories than what you're consuming because you're continuing to lose weight, even though all the macros and the different components are all lining up, you're getting most of the nutrients, but you're still losing weight. You simply need more calories. You need to add more calories in dietary fat, generally then in the form of monounsaturated fat. So these are polyunsaturated fats. I'm sorry, I said that wrong. These are monounsaturated fats like olive oil and avocado oil. And we'll get to polyunsaturated fats later. Okay, so let's talk about some other food classes. These other, not macronutrient specific, then these are just different types of food. So let's talk about dairy. So dairy is a controversial topic, and you've probably seen some videos by Dr. Hyman and others who will very specifically say that consumption of dairy will increase your risk of fracture. And the studies that they cite there are not invalid, but what they're doing in those studies is looking at adults, asking them how much milk they consumed when they were kids, and then looking at their risk of fracture over time. And it turns out that if you consume more dairy as a child, you may have an increased risk of fracture. But it's not necessarily because of the dairy itself or the consumption of dairy. It's actually that dairy does lead to an increase in height. And if you consume a significant amount of dairy as a child, your IGF-1, which I mentioned earlier, IGF-1 will go up, and this will provoke a height increase. This is why people that consume dairy get taller. But increased height is actually a risk factor for falls and fracture. And so we know that you can probably account for all that increased risk just by the increase in height alone. So it's not directly the dairy, it's indirectly the dairy. But the big point here is that while that might be true if you consume dairy as a kid, you're not a kid. You're not growing vertically. And so we don't need to worry about that risk as an adult. Now, dairy might not be tolerated, but it's not going to increase the risk of fracture like they're saying in those videos, because that's a very specific scenario. It may not be tolerated because of either the lactose or the casein, and there's some ways around that, but some people just can't tolerate dairy, especially as we age. This gets harder and harder. So I see that about probably half of our population doesn't tolerate like milk, for example, but there are some other options. We know that dairy does increase IGF-1. Like I just said, it increases it in kids, and that's why they grow taller. But imagine if you want to build muscle and bone, increasing IGF-1 is actually a good idea. We actually recommend peptides for that because they're IGF-1 peptides, they can drive that. And so dairy is a way to do that kind of naturally, although arguably consuming dairy is unnatural. Other ways to consume dairy that are beneficial and can avoid some of the potential negatives of a lot of lactose and casein would be considering raw dairy. Now, this is not legal in every state, or it's hard to find in some states. And one of the benefits of raw dairy is that lactoferrin, which is a protein, immunoglobulins, and other growth factors are present in raw dairy that are not present in dairy that's been processed. The reason for that is the pasteurization, the heating of the milk or whatever product it is going to destroy those proteins. They're heat sensitive. So raw dairy gives you the potential of those things. Now, in theory, there's a risk of raw dairy with contamination and bacterial contamination, a potential risk from a health perspective, an infection perspective. But if raw dairy is produced appropriately and distributed appropriately, that you can avoid that. The government doesn't like it, and the dairy industry kind of in general doesn't like it. So it can be hard to find something to check out at your own risk. Fermented dairy, harder cheeses, kefir, cottage cheese, these are all things that can be consumed that may not bother people as much. Yogurt, same thing. Milk in general can be hard to consume for a lot of people because it has a lot of lactose and a lot of casein. Consider consuming other types of milk, like A2 milk that could come from A2 specific breeds of cow, goat, sheep, and camel, I think. So other sources of food that people like to talk about that can be very controversial, things like beans or lentils. I'm not a fan myself. I don't think that they need to be consumed. People talk about the protein benefits of beans. I think that's not a good source of protein. They're incomplete protein. You have to mix and match and eat a ton of carbohydrate to get adequate protein through beans. But some people want to eat beans. So if you're going to eat beans, it's probably okay. Just make sure that you're soaking them. Make sure you're getting as much of the anti-nutrient out as possible. And again, watching your carbohydrate intake. What about soy? So soy is a popular protein source for people that are consuming a plant-based diet. And soy is okay because it is a complete protein source. But so much soy is produced, a lot of it is not organic. A lot of it's sprayed with pesticides, it's sprayed with glyphosate. It is a pretty toxic thing if you are getting a lot of that in there. And so you have to be careful with where your soy is produced. And then if you're consuming a lot of soy, there's concerns about, again, some of the anti-nutrients, but also phytoestrogen. So phytoestrogens are present in soy. This can have an impact on both men and women. So some women are trying to avoid estrogen. Some women want more estrogen. So you just have to understand that if you're consuming a lot of soy, you're potentially getting a lot of contaminants, but you're also going to be getting a lot of phytoestrogens, which will bind estrogen receptors. All right. What about grains? So the reason why I haven't talked about grains until now is that I just don't like them in general, kind of like beans. I just feel like grains are not required, or at least not to the extent that we think they are. People eat so many grains in our culture. So for me, wheat is a hard no, especially in the United States. Our wheat has changed dramatically over the last several decades, and our wheat is toxic. It is bred to have more gluten in it. It is just absolutely toxic. So my recommendation is no wheat. If you want to consume other, gluten-free products, that'll be with other types of grains, and that can be okay, but I would just limit it. Sourdough is a way to consume bread. If you need to consume bread, I haven't had bread in years. You just don't need it, but I get it. Some people really want bread. Other grains like oats, make sure they're gluten-free. Those can be contaminated. Make sure they're organic because they're going to be sprayed with glyphosate. They're going to be sprayed with other pesticides. You're going to absorb a lot of that if you consume those oats, and they're toxic to you and your bones. Rice can be okay too. It has the potential to have a lot of contaminants in it. But if you get organic rice, particularly from California, there's some good companies that are growing some great rice. So you can consume grains. You can do it in a reasonable way. Again, obviously watch your carbohydrates because they're going to be very carbohydrate dense. What about seeds? People love chia seeds and other types of seeds. If you go back to this idea that plants don't want to be eaten and they want you to eat their fruit, but they definitely don't want you to eat their babies. So I kind of like this idea that plant babies are going to be highly protected. They have the potential to be toxic, but chia seeds can be a great source of fiber. Pumpkin seeds are a great source of other nutrients. Again, I'm okay with that as long as your gut's working appropriately, you're not getting inflamed as a result of it, and you're not overloading in carbohydrates. All right, I think lastly, nuts. Nuts have the potential to have some nutrients in them. Sometimes they can be very nutrient dense. They're high in good omega-6s. They have some plant forms of omega-3s in them, but they can be inflammatory. For people that struggle with overweight and obesity, they can be really hard to control. From a volume perspective, I know I could personally sit down and eat 3,000 calories worth of nuts in a sitting. So I don't consume them again myself, but some people want them. Some people need those calories. So the things that I recommend for people specifically in the nut category would be almonds, pecans, macadamia nuts. I think those are probably the cleanest. I would avoid peanut butter. It's actually not a nut, and it also has a high likelihood of being contaminated with mold and has a lot of anti-nutrients in it. So peanut butter can be pretty toxic for people. All right, what other things to avoid? I don't like to be overly restrictive, but excess sugar, you got to cut it out. It's just inflammatory. Highly processed foods, you got to cut them out. I like to look at foods like this. You've heard people maybe talk about an ancestral diet. Most people, when they do that, are talking about, going back thousands of years. I think that's probably a little over restrictive because we do have a lot of potential good foods that we can eat. So what I recommend then is let's eat an ancestral diet, but let's not go all the way back to, pre 2,000 years ago. Let's just talk about what existed in the 1800s. If you go back 150 years, for example, then you're going to get rid of all of the highly processed foods. You're going to get rid of all of the seed oils and highly processed omega-6 dense oils. Get rid of all of those things. And then just eat the things that you know that are good for you. You know that meat is good for you, or at least hopefully you do now. You know that certain plants can be good for you depending on how you prepare them and eat them. All of the things that come in whole forms that have one ingredient, which you can then mix and match to make a thing, but eating highly processed foods from highly synthetic compounds is just not good for us. Our bodies just simply don't know what to do with it. I don't think that we need to be over restrictive. I think, again, the ancestral diet can get over restrictive. Being carnivore is great for some people, not great for others. I personally don't feel great on a carnivore diet. I need a fair amount, not that much, but a fair amount of fiber, a little bit of carbohydrate for me to feel my best. Same thing with the plant-based diets. Some people do really well. I've talked to some people that can mix and match and make a really great vegan diet, and that's fine. But that's not most people. Most people overeat carbohydrates. They eat a lot of processed food. They're protein deficient and they get fat and nutrient depleted. So I don't think that we need to be in those very, very restrictive camps. Finding that balance, figuring out what you need or working with somebody to help you do that is really, really key. When it comes to the pH question, am I going to change the pH of my blood and leach calcium from my bone if I eat meat? Is garbage. It is absolute nonsense. If anybody's talking about that, change the channel. The reason why it's nonsense is that our body is so good at buffering pH. We have a very, very tight pH that we operate in, and we naturally fluctuate up and down within that pH. It's part of the cells in bone. And for example, we need to actually fluctuate down and up so that our osteoclasts and osteoblasts are turned on and turned off. This is actually the natural rhythm, and our body is so good at manipulating pH through the way that we breathe, through the way that our kidneys work. Consuming, I would say, almost any food is probably not going to impact pH. Definitely true with meat, in my opinion. And just think of it this way. The pH of your stomach is 1. It is about as acidic as you can get. So why would we think that anything else is going to have an impact on our pH of our blood if we know that everything starts out being mixed with a pH of 1? So our body's really good at buffering those things. If you want to reduce pH because you don't believe me, okay, fine. But don't eat sugar, don't eat grains, don't drink alcohol. It is not a protein issue. It is not a meat issue. It is a potentially chronic eating of highly processed foods and drinking alcohol all day long. Maybe you could impact your pH, but I think the negatives of those things don't actually come from pH. They probably come from other things. And I think too, just to bring that point to a close, when I hear people talk about pH, they're almost always talking about meat, which doesn't make any sense. What you don't hear them say is, if you want to impact your pH, then stop eating sugar, stop eating processed foods, and don't drink alcohol. I don't hear anybody saying don't eat dark chocolate and drink a glass of wine to improve your pH. No, they always talk about meat. And if they're only talking about meat, then they are biased towards eliminating meat from the food supply, and they're trying to find a reason to support that. And the literature on pH just doesn't support it. I've looked at it ad nauseum. I've got videos about it, and you can go watch those. All right, so that's it. And that was much longer than my 2023 video on diet. And I've tried to be a little bit more inclusive because I get some feedback that what I eat is too limiting. I'm just telling you what I eat is what I eat. But what I see is that through our dietitians and coaches that are working with our patients, that people want to include more variety, and that's totally fine as long as they're getting the nutrients they need, monitoring their biomarkers, making sure that their body is tolerating what they're eating, doing functional testing as needed, testing the gut to see what additional things need to be included. We can consume a lot of these things. The human body has a remarkable capacity to adjust to the diet that's being fed. Just think of that difference between a carnivore diet and a vegan diet. The fact that we can exist and really thrive on either is very remarkable. So we probably don't have to be as restrictive as I am personally. I just eat what I eat for me because it works for me. And we've opened up a little bit more based on the recommendations from our dietitians, what we recommend for others. So that's enough for that. If you want to be able to ask me questions, if you want to join a community of people who are trying to optimize their bone health and their health span, consider joining our Health Span Nation. Head to drdouglucas.com to check that out. Within the Health Span Nation, there's going to be a weekly Q&A. We've started these. They're super fun. Weekly Q&A that's topic driven. We do interviews in there. The ability to join those either live or watch them later. You can ask questions that we'll either we'll take them ahead of time and we'll answer them, or you can ask them live. So those have been a whole lot of fun to do, and I'm really enjoying working with a community like that. A lot of our patients are in there, but we have other people as well. You also then have the access to our affiliate links and discount codes for products and services that we've vetted that make sense from a health span perspective. Then you also have the community, so you can join other people within our community and ask them questions, get their experience on things that have worked for them. So it's a protected environment where you can ask questions and not necessarily have to be on like Facebook or other unprotected environments like that. And then starting Q1 2024, we're going to start building an informational vault, a content vault, which will be directed mostly at HealthSpan. And it's going to have a lot of great fun stuff in it. So I'm really, really excited about HealthSpan Nation. Consider joining us there. Thank you so much for making it to the end of this video. This is a tough topic, but I hope you found this helpful. Disclaimer. This presentation is for general informational purposes only, does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this presentation are at the user's own risk. The content in this presentation is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. See you next time.